This subwoofer is a hidden gem. It's supposed to be one of the best sound quality subwoofers on the market. I've got two of them. Let's build a box. But not just any box. This one's gonna have some really cool stuff, so keep watching. You don't wanna miss any of it. As always, the process starts by modeling the enclosure in WinISD and drawing up some plans in SketchUp. I'll be sure to put a link to those plans along with a link to the subwoofers, the ports, and everything else you're gonna need for this build down in the video description. Hey, once all the computer work is done, it's time to head over to the table saw and break down the sheet goods. Now, there is a method you can use to ensure a tight-fitting enclosure even if your measurements are not perfectly accurate. More on that later in the video. You may have noticed that I'm using a mixture of MDF and plywood. That's because I'm trying to use up some scrap material from previous projects. Before you go any further, now's a good time to do a dry fit and make sure everything, well, you know, fits. This design calls for a pair of 3-inch precision ports. So in addition to the normal brace down the middle of the box, it's also going to have a support for the ports. Now it's time for the cool part. My goal here is to make this shape right here by combining some circle templates with some straight templates. Then the plan is to make a trim ring using the material gap tool. The insert ring is going to be wrapped in vinyl and that will pressure fit against carpet. The idea here is to alternate colors. I'm going to use a charcoal gray carpet on the enclosure. That's going to transition to black vinyl on the trim ring, then gray vinyl on the subwoofer baffle, and then finally the black subwoofer. These subwoofers are Dayton Audio reference drivers. They've got this cool aluminum cone which gives them a very distinctive look.
Very distinctive style.
So let's get to work. Step one, grab some measuring tools. This thing here is called a combination square. So here I'm laying out the location of the subwoofers on the inner baffle. The plan is to oversize the cutouts on the outer baffle so that I can recess the drivers. For the speaker cutouts and to lay out the recess, I'm going to use some of these rings right here. The last time I used these rings in a video, several people jumped in the comments and said that I should be using a circle jig instead. I've got a circle jig. I actually prefer using the rings because I can use the router table behind me, and that router table has better dust collection. After everything is laid out, it's just a matter of sticking the rings to the baffles and routing out the speaker cutouts. If you want, you can rough cut this with a jigsaw first. I opted to skip that step this time, and I could definitely hear the router struggling to get through all of that material in one pass. So I do recommend taking the extra time and doing that rough cut with a jigsaw. This is a 1/4-inch spiral cut flush trim bit. When you buy your first router, you're probably also gonna go ahead and pick up a set of inexpensive router bits. These things are great to get started. But if you're gonna do any of this template routing, go ahead and drop some cash on some quality flush trim bits. I've had good luck with white side bits. Off camera, I used some double-sided tape to attach the outer baffle to the inner baffle. Now the inner baffle serves as a template for the outer baffle. There are two advantages to doing it this way. First, if my measurements were a little bit off, when I set up that inner baffle, I'm gonna have a perfect copy of that and everything's still going to line up. And second, you only have to spend time laying out locations on that inner baffle. If you wanted to, you could set these aside for now, but I'm gonna go through another step. I want to recess that driver. I just like the way it looks. It's not something that you have to do. And for that step, I'm going to be cutting a rabbet into the outer baffle, which means I've got to change the router bit. And what that does is create this lip that allows me to trim this hole out so it'll fit around the outside of the subwoofer. To do that, we need to install a flush trim bit. And right here, both my cameras died, and so I didn't get this part on film, but here are the finished baffles. And now's a good time to do a test fit. If it's wrong, you want to know about it now, not after you finish putting everything together. All that was step one. Now it's time for step two. My goal here is to make this shape right here by combining some circle templates with some straight templates. I'm going to make that shape on some 1/2-inch MDF that I've got left over from another project. For these initial stages of this step, it would probably make better sense to use some thinner material. Thinner material is cheaper and it's easier to cut. We'll begin this stage by tracing out the subwoofer cutouts onto that 1/2-inch material. You need to know where the drivers are going to be at so that your design elements don't interfere with the subwoofers. Another affordable and useful tool is a speed square. You can literally pick these up for just a few bucks. And most of them are gonna have indents where the markings are. You just stick a pencil into, say in this case, the 1-inch indent, and you can quickly mark out lines that are parallel to the edges. If you're doing this for yourself, you can make any design that you want by combining arcs and circles and straight pieces. You don't even really need to go out and buy all these templates. You can use scrap material from previous projects. Off camera, I rough cut the shape with a jigsaw and tape down some template. You'll notice that the circle template is sitting on top of the straight template. So to route this out, you need to use a bit with multiple bearings. In the last step, I used a bit with a single bearing, so I had to swap out the bit. If I had just started out with this bit, I could have saved myself a couple of minutes. So if you're doing this yourself, take some time to plan a few steps ahead. This process requires several different router bits, and 10 minutes of planning might save you 30 minutes of work. So my outer template shape is now finished. I'm going to grab a piece of MDF and transfer it to that piece of MDF. Now I could have just used these plastic template shapes to do the step I'm about to do and added an extra step because I wanted to save this piece right here and have it in case I mess something up later on in the process. This is like saving your game before you start the boss fight. When I get finished transferring this template, I'll have an inner shape and an outer shape. Then I can use the material gap tool to resize the inner shape so that I get a good fit between the carpet and the vinyl. Off camera, I drilled a 1/4 inch starter hole so that I could use this 1/4 inch flush trim bit. And you know what that means? I've got to change the bit again. Looking back over the footage, now I realize I could have used this 1/4 inch flush trim bit for the last 3 cuts. And now I understand why Mark has 3 routers. If I had a multiple router setup, I could just leave this in one of the routers so it's there anytime that I need it, and that would have saved a ton of time. Now I made a small mistake and I ended up with a big gash right here where I started the cut. If you're gonna be a DIYer, you're gonna make mistakes. You just have to learn how to roll with them.
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
Instead of starting over, just grab some Bondo and fill in that gash. Now this piece right here is not gonna be big enough for it to press fit into place later on. So you've got to go through some steps to get it sized exactly right. The first part of that process is to take the insert shape and oversize it by 1/4 inch all the way around. You're doing this to add back the material that your 1/4 inch bit just removed. For that, you've got to start by changing the router bit. With the bit in place and that inner piece taped down, you set that oversized bearing so that it rides on that inside piece and start cutting. Now that this piece has been upsized, you have to downsize. Now this tool set came with this bit that's designed to make some very small rabbets. You start by installing this router bit, making a cut, flipping it over, making a cut, flipping it over, and you do that until you get the shape reduced to the size that you need. It's probably a good idea to keep a tally of your cuts. It would really suck to find out that you've miscounted later on when you try to wrap this piece in vinyl. And when you finish cutting all those rabbets, you need to trim the last one flush. Guess what that means? Then you've got to change the router bit. Okay, this is taking a while, but technically we're still on step 2. Here's what we've done so far. We've got an outer trim piece that's going to be wrapped in carpet after it's attached to the enclosure. Then we have an inner insert piece, and that piece needs to be transformed into a ring. Before you do that, I recommend making a copy of this piece right here. Again, save the game before the next boss fight. So tape that precisely sized insert piece to a fresh piece of MDF and hit it with that flush trim bit. Thankfully, I still have the flush trim bit in the router, so I don't have to change the bit. Up to this point, everything that I've made could have been made with 1/4 inch material. That would save money and it's a lot easier to cut. But this piece here needs to be 1/2 inch material, or maybe even thicker. Here's why. When you finish copying that piece, you need to cut a rabbet. And you know what that means, don't you? I've got to change the router bit. After you cut the rabbet, guess what? Change the router bit again so you can trim it out with your 1/4 inch flush trim bit. Here I've drilled a 1/4 inch hole and inserted a 1/4 inch flush trim bit in that hole. When I'm done with this, I'll have a ring that I can use as an insert. Well, not really, but what I will have is a very thin and very flimsy piece of MDF that I can use as a template. I can then transfer that shape to another piece of MDF and use an oversized bearing to oversize it. Well, I could do that, but instead I need to go back to my last save point and start over because I screwed this step up. If it were just a few minor bumps and divots, I could have busted out the Bondo, but it was pretty bad. Unfortunately, that means 2 extra bit swaps. After going back to fix that mistake, I am ready to move on. Now you have to oversize that piece, and for that, you've got to start by changing the router bit. To make this a little bit easier to cut on the router, I'm going to use a bearing to mark out a cut line, and then rough cut that with a jigsaw. The process here is the same. You grab some double-side tape, you stick the template to the piece that will become the insert, and you run the bearing along the template. And at this stage, we have all of our parts cut out for the front of the enclosure. There's an inner baffle, an outer trim ring, and an inner trim ring. But we're not done yet. The inner ring has a few imperfections. I'll fix that with some Bondo off camera. The outer ring is 1/2 inch material. I want to transfer that to some 3/4 inch material. Now, if I would have been thinking ahead, I would have done this step when I had the flush trim bit installed earlier, but I didn't. So now I need to change router bits. And it was at this point in the build that I realized that all of these router bit changeouts were killing my productivity. So I took a second to look around and see if there was anything else that needed a flush trim, like the brace and the port cutouts. Well, now's a good time to take care of that while the bit is in the router. But lo and behold, the brace needed one of those double bearing bits, and I had installed the single bearing bit instead. For the next step, we need a roundover. To do that, you have to change the router bit. Now I'm finally beginning to wise up. I went ahead and took care of the roundover on the outer trim ring and the outer baffle while I had the roundover bit installed. I also want to put a roundover on the inside edge of that trim ring, but this 1/2 inch bit is just a little bit too aggressive. So I need a smaller roundover. To make that smaller roundover, I have to change the router bit. Now we need to cut a rabbet. To do that, you have to change the router bit. I'm going to put a rabbet on the underside of the outer trim ring and then 2 rabbets on the underside of the inner trim ring. I also need a rabbet on the end pieces of the enclosure. All of that is done in order to make it easier to wrap the box in carpet and vinyl later on in the build. So that is the end of step 2. Step 2 is finally complete. Before we move on to the next step, here's my first impression of this car audio fabrication material gap tool. So far, it works exactly as described. I won't know for sure how it's going to turn out until I finish wrapping all the pieces, and at that point I'll see how well this trim ring fits. But there are 2 downsides. First, as you have just seen, this was a very time-consuming process. Making a box like this is a lot of work. I now have a whole lot more respect for the people who do this kind of thing for a living, and I understand why shops charge through the nose for this kind of enclosure. Now, even though it was time-consuming, I made a bunch of mistakes. I'm certain that I'll get faster with practice, and hey, I bet adding a second or even a third router will make a huge difference in my productivity. Which brings me to the second drawback. These bits and templates, man, they are not cheap. Let me be really clear about what I mean here. No single individual part in this setup is really all that expensive, but all these templates and bits comprise a system and they're all intended to be used together. In fact, all of this stuff right here set me back close to $900. And at that point, you start to think that there might be a better way. Just to see what would happen, I fired up the laser and I cut some 1/4 inch material and made an inner and outer template. Now that laser is not the ultimate solution. Right now I'm limited to about a 15 by 15 cutting area, but for some extra money, Xtool will sell you some extended rails for the laser, and that'll kick you up to about a 15 by 30 cutting area. I'll explore using the laser to cut out custom templates for an individual project at some point in the future, but for now I've got to get this project finished. I don't know about you, but for some reason I always start my enclosures by attaching the back to the bottom. The box itself is held together with wood glue and brad nails. In this shot here, you can see that I'm using a few clamps. Clamps are extra hands. I use them to hold everything together while I drive brad nails. In fact, before I got a brad nailer, I just clamped and glued all my enclosures. I know a lot of people like to glue and screw their enclosures. That is stronger, but it's also a lot slower and it's complete overkill for a box like this. If this were a big SPL build with multiple 18s, it would be worth the trouble. The build uses a pair of Dayton Audio reference subwoofers. These are the dual 4-ohm 10-inch subwoofers. Rumor has it that these are some of the best sound quality subs on the market. They allegedly have very low distortion. I'll give you my opinion about that at the end of the video. Hey, here's a little tip for you. In this shot right here, you can see a piece of scrap wood that I'm using to make sure the sides of the enclosure are going to sit flush with the back and the bottom of the enclosure. For this build, the plans call for a pair of 3-inch precision ports. I'll make sure to give you a link to the ports and the subwoofers down in the video description. And the plans will tell you how long you need to make the ports. At this stage right here, you want to go ahead and cut the ports to length so that you can test fit this piece right here. This is the port support. A port support is not 100% necessary, but I always like to include one anytime I use a round port because I want to make sure the port is secure inside the enclosure. And this port support needs to be sized so you have plenty of clearance for the subwoofer itself. These subs are slightly more than 5¼ inch deep. From there, you want to go ahead and add the main brace. And here's one of those spots where you want to stop, do some measuring, make sure you've got this brace in the best location possible. You want it as far away from the end of the port as possible without interfering with the speaker cutouts. The plans linked below will show you the approximate location, but again, you want to test and verify this when you're building the enclosure. When you're ready to glue and nail that brace into the enclosure, the smart thing to do is to trace out the location on the outside of the box. I didn't do that, but I really should have taken the time to take that step. Now the internals are sorted out, and when that's done, you can lay down the baffle and follow that by the top of the box. And if you just want a functional enclosure that's going to sound good, you really could stop right here. But I want more than that, and really you should too. So I've made a second baffle that's got an oversized cutout so the subwoofer will sit recessed into the enclosure. This is completely an aesthetic decision. It's just done so the box looks good. You could just double up on the baffle so that you've got a nice thick heavy-duty baffle and skip that recess. But hopefully the extra effort of cutting that recess and putting a round over on the recess will improve the finished look of the box. And on top of that baffle, I'm going to glue and nail on this trim ring right here. I'm calling this the outer trim ring. The plan is to wrap the front of this box in some combination of carpet and vinyl. Before I do that, I want to take a minute to hit the box with some black paint. Any place where there may be a scene or a transition, this black paint will help camouflage mistakes. I find that works really well if I'm using a black carpet, but not quite as well in this case where I'm going to be using a charcoal carpet. I build enough boxes now where I just buy this in bulk from Parts Express. I've had a few people ask me about the spray gun that I'm using here. This is just a cheap Harbor Freight spray gun. If you keep an eye out on their sale flyers, you can literally pick one of these things up for 10 bucks. The other tip, make sure you've got a decent air compressor. I've been using a 6-gallon 150 PSI pancake compressor, but it could only deliver 2.6 CFM, and that just wasn't enough flow to use the sprayer effectively. I had to upgrade to a larger compressor. 4.3 CFM seemed to do the trick. And the worst part about this part is the waiting. After you spray the box and the carpet, you gotta give it a few minutes to tack up. You don't wanna rush this process. And after it's tacked up, you can just stick the two pieces together. You can see in this shot here that I masked off the inner baffle before spraying it with adhesive. I'm not quite ready to get a bunch of adhesive on that part. And after wrapping the carpet over the front, the next step is to cut out some relief cuts in that carpet and start pressing it down over the round over on that outer trim piece. This is my favorite tool for doing carpet work. It's one of these breakaway razor knives, but the end has this little metal pry bar on the end of it, so I can use one tool to cut and tuck the carpet. Flip the box over, spray some more adhesive on the back of the box, and you're gonna have two ends of the carpet. Just fold those over the top of each other and take a really good sharp blade and cut both pieces of carpet at the same time. And when you do this, the two pieces are going to mate with each other perfectly, and you'll have a nice invisible seam right here. I probably had to practice this a dozen times before the seam really did look invisible. For the sides, back when I was doing the woodworking part, I added a rabbited groove to the side pieces, and that groove now becomes a guide for your knife when you trim out the carpet on the side. And hey, now you're at another point where you could just stop and install the subs, the ports, and the terminal cup, wire it all together, and be on your way. You don't have to go through all these extra steps, but every time I build a box, I try to make it better than the last one. If I don't challenge myself, how am I gonna get any better? So I'm gonna add some gray vinyl to the front of the enclosure. You can see here that I did spray the back side of the vinyl and the baffle of the enclosure with some adhesive. So now I just lay that piece of vinyl down, grab the knife, make some relief cuts, and grab the heat gun. Don't try it without a heat gun. As I hit it with the heat gun, the vinyl just molds right into place on that roundover with virtually no effort. From there, I push the vinyl under that lip on the outer trim ring and trim that out with a sharp knife. Now I'm going to add an inner trim ring, so I'm going to spray some adhesive on that trim ring. You can see in this shot right here that the ring has a rabbited groove on both sides. That's to give you a spot to stick the vinyl when you're wrapping it. With some relief cuts and the heat gun, this step was actually pretty easy. And this is literally the first time I've tried to wrap a trim ring like this. And to be honest, I thought it was going to be a lot harder, but it did take a lot of time and it took a lot of prep work. But after investing the time into the prep work, it wasn't that bad. In this shot here, you can see that I did get some adhesive on the front side of that vinyl. You can clean that up with mineral spirits. It wiped right off. And with that done, the snap ring just presses right into place. The fit was a bit snug, which is really what you want. You want it to stay in place.
I want to pause for a minute and say thank you to the sponsors of this video, all of the patrons over on Patreon. This channel is fully supported by viewers just like you. And I want to give a great big shout out to my $25 and up patrons, Jonathan, Taylor, Timothy, JD America, Bo, and Joaquin. For exclusive behind the scenes content and a community chat, head over to Patreon and sign up today.
Moving on to the ports. These are ABS plastic, and you want to use an ABS cement when gluing them all together. My local big box store stocks an all-purpose plastic cement that will get the job done. Now the tricky part is you can't just assemble the port outside of the enclosure and slide it in, because that inner opening has a big flare on it as well. So what you want to do is stick those flares together outside of the box and then reach into the speaker cutouts to finish gluing everything together.
The other tricky part about ports is figuring out the tuning frequency, and to help you out with that, I've got a port length calculator over on my website, DIYaudioguy.com. In this case, we're using an Aeroport that is a round port with 2 flared ends. So we can head over to the Aeroport calculator, plug in our information, and find out our port length.
The one thing I don't like about these ports is the inside end doesn't have screw holes, so I tend to just glue these to the port support. This time I'm using some epoxy. I think it's JB Weld. After trying this out, I have to say that I don't recommend using it. It's strong enough and it will stick to both the wood and the ABS, but it is a little bit runny. I'm going to recommend hot glue instead. And after using all these adhesives inside the box, you're going to want to wait for them to cure before installing the subs. I don't know for sure that this stuff will release any gases during the curing process that might damage the subwoofers, but why take that chance? Hey, and as you're growing your tool collection, get a cheap set of center punches. Use these to mark out the screw locations on the baffle. When I first started doing this, I used to just drill pilot holes with the speakers resting in the cutouts, and that just increases the chance of drilling a hole through the speaker. After wiring everything in parallel for 1 ohm load, I screwed the subs down, and here I've got the multimeter, and you can see that it reads just over 1 ohm. That's normal. This black box right here is one of my favorite tools. I use it to verify the tuning frequency. Looks like it landed right around 33 hertz. That's gonna give me a nice musical enclosure. And hey, here's the finished box, and it looks absolutely amazing. But how does it sound? Well, it's really hard to convey the sound quality over YouTube. You just kind of have to take my word for it. Loud bass tends to clip the microphones, and oftentimes all you really can hear is the vehicle rattling. But here's a clip anyway. One of my favorite test tracks is the first track from Techmaster PEB's album, It Came From Outer Bass. It opens with some really brutal low notes that are well below the tuning frequency, and that causes the subwoofers to unload, meaning the subs are moving as if they were in free air. And since the frequencies are low enough that they're on the edge of human hearing, that's when you'll be able to detect mechanical noise coming from the subwoofers, and these things were really quiet. All I could hear was the truck rattling. And after playing a few test tracks and some of my favorite songs, I can honestly say that these are some of the lowest distortion subwoofers that I've ever had. I'm not getting mechanical noise, I'm not getting distortion, I'm not getting any port noise. So no doubt in my mind that this is both the best looking and best sounding subwoofer enclosure that I've ever built. To catch the next video, click right here and subscribe so that you don't miss it. I'm Justin, this is the DIY Audio Guy YouTube channel, and I will see you on the next one.